Welcome to my multi-part series on how to build and host a Saas solution. In the first part, I will be talking about hosting, talking about cloud versus Vercel. And in part two, I'll be going into the depths of the architecture on what it really takes in building out a Saas solution. In today's video, what I want to do is provide a high-level overview and an introduction to the first part, which is hosting, cloud versus Vercel. Going through a little bit of a solution on how do you go about approaching and implementing a SaaS solution, like from a URL perspective, right? So you might have seen both of these. So depending on your requirements, you have to pick and choose the two different options, right? So the first one is you have multi-domain, right, or a subdomain solution, right? So your application, your SaaS application handles requests based on coming from a tenant1.example.com or tenant2.example.com. So this is your subdomain. It takes a look at the subdomain, and based on that, it switches its mode. So all the URLs following URLs are going to be the same for tenant1 and tenant2. For example, /admin, all of that information is the same. It feels a lot closer to your own. So you get a little bit of that ownership where you've got, there's examples like Zoom, for example, right? So you'll have company name dot zoom.com, right? So that's how they handle multi-tenancy and a SaaS solution. So it's kind of nice. I actually lean towards this more, but it depends on the requirements, right? Of course, the challenges there are the actual initial setup is the SSL certificates. It's got the wildcards. So it's a little bit more complex to set up, and it becomes a little bit hard to use out of the box cloud infrastructures that are out there, for example, like Vercel. The other solution is the URL path. So you might have noticed this as well. So you might have example.com /tenant ID, and off it goes where you would have the further paths around this SaaS solution. Most SaaS solutions are like that. That's at least what I've noticed. It works well based on the URL. You can identify who that exact person is, and you can have your business rules inside your application to handle those cases. Now, one might say that based on who the user is logged in, you might have different behaviors already. Um, that is a good point. However, if you're dealing with a requirement where a user can belong to multiple tenants, then it might become an issue where how do you know, okay, this is the same user with the same email? How do you know which um, um, company website it's actually logging into, right? So you will have multiple tenants associated with a user. So in that case, I would actually prefer to move on to this example. But it all depends on the requirements, on what those requirements are. So I just wanted to give an overview on what are the two different ways and what are the pros and cons of it. But there's definitely a lot more depth and details that I did not cover in this one. Also, just looking at a very high level. So when you actually decide to host your application, your SaaS application, you would have an option of cloud versus Vercel or Netlify or other cloud systems that are there. Um, the third one that I've actually not listed here is the backend as a service, right? So Supabase, for example, that's one example. So these are backend services, APIs that these are solutions built on top of your typical cloud offerings, so GCP, AWS, or Azure, and they just make life easier for the developer and for the engineering team to manage and deploy the different patterns or the use cases that you want to handle. So Vercel, Supabase, the backend as a service, Netlify. So those are good. It's really, really fast to set them up initially, right? So within like 20, 30 minutes, we'll have a whole video on those. It's super fast to actually deploy those, your applications on these ones. They help you out a lot. And from a pricing perspective, they're very, very reasonable, almost free. And I think these are great when you want to have a maybe not a really complex system, but maybe medium to lightweight system or an application that you want to go live with, right? Or to experiment in the market with. But anytime you want to handle more complicated use cases like SaaS solutions and things like that, you might be able to experiment initially, but eventually you might want to consider and going to the cloud, right? So because it has limited options for DB, so Vercel gives you the option for Postgres, which is fine. But if you want to use a different one, you could use it. Obviously, you can make a connection to that database. However, it's going over the internet, right? So it's not under a VPC, a VPN. So from a security perspective and from a performance perspective, you're going to start taking hits. In fact, if you compare and deploying your container on, let's say, AWS versus Vercel, like having an application there, the solution on the cloud, like AWS, is I've noticed that we'll do demos, but it's about 50% faster, right? So that's the kind of the initial results that I'm seeing. Um, so Vercel must be doing tons of stuff, abstractions and things like that, that is maybe adding to the performance hit. But that's what I've noticed, that the cloud itself is actually a lot faster because it's bare bone, if you will. So, like I mentioned about the cloud, it's more expensive. There is a higher learning curve. My gosh, if you want to do AWS, it's a whole encyclopedia now. You might take, maybe 6 months to fully understand what's going on. You need to have a depth of knowledge on your networking, CI/CD, performance, monitoring, log, all of that, right? So to initially set that up, it's actually quite time expensive, right? And also, it is more expensive from an infrastructure perspective because the way how Vercel and the other wrappers are making the cost lower is they're able to have the right tools and share resources between different customers, right? So, whereas if you go bare bone, there's no sharing that's happening. So, for example, if you want to fire up a Postgres database, well, it's your own single tenant Postgres database, right? Whereas if you do it in Vercel, they do it for free because so many other thousands of customers are also using the same instance, right? Uh, so things to keep in mind. Um, Cloud, I would say, is a little bit better from a SaaS perspective. It gives you a lot more freedom. Yes, initial cost is higher. So what I would actually suggest is maybe, okay, go launch your product and maybe get the feel of it on Vercel. But once you think that, okay, we got to go a little bit more mature, there's a lot more use cases that you need to handle, maybe start looking into the cloud solutions, right? So let's say you've got use cases around event-based architecture. So let's say a user performs an action on your application and you want to trigger a SQS message, a message queue, and then you would have serverless functions on the other end that you want to get executed, right? So all of that is going to be on the raw cloud infrastructure, right? So you might as well get used to it. You might as well have the entire application on the cloud than just having a bit of bits and pieces in cloud versus Vercel. So lots to unpack here, but I hope this is makes you start thinking on the different elements to consider before going from Vercel to cloud, cloud to Vercel. All right. Now, when you have actually decided to go to AWS versus GCP, um, so there's obviously the other one, the Azure. That's going to be out of scope. I'll be just looking at AWS and GCP. Maybe in a later video, I can actually talk about Azure. But with AWS and GCP, what I've actually, I'm a um, pretty early adopter of AWS. So I know AWS quite a lot, but recently in the last couple of years, it has changed a lot as well. So I'm just doing catching up. For GCP, I haven't touched too much, but I have recently started looking into it. What I've actually discovered so far is that GCP is a lot easier to get going. But once you want to get into the advanced topics, like wildcard certificates and things like that with the Cloud Run, it gets a little bit complicated and dicey, right? There's some functionalities that you have to revert to the CLI, like the GCP CLI, and maybe those functionality are not there on the cloud UI. Whereas AWS, I believe it's more complex. It's more raw, but it gives you the greatest flexibility, right? So if you want to consider or set up the security groups, the VPNs, the VPCs, it's a lot of um, flexibility that it offers you. So these are awesome topics, and I will be covering all of this in detail in my future videos. So stick around and see you guys tomorrow.